In light of today's gospel and Christ's teaching on being aware of the beam in our own eyes before trying to pluck out the splinter in another's, I couldn't help but thinking of a certain phenomenon called the Apostolate of being. The Apostolate of being basically means that the greatest way to truly preach the gospel is embodying it within our own selves. So to the degree that we ourselves are converted to the truth of Jesus Christ within our own self, we immediately become a light that shines upon the darkness of others and can go far deeper than any logical argumentation that we could ever give them. It's like if I start changing my ways and start eating right or going to the gym, the people I'm hanging around with, just by the very fact that I'm doing it, will be an illumination for them to think about what they're eating or how they're lifting weights. So for that, I want to talk about 3 stories. It's actually one of the most profound stories I've ever read, but it's 90 pages long. So it's 90 pages, and I'm only going to condense it into a 45-minute homily. So you're welcome. I'll try to do my best, but it's a little much. It begins with a young man named Marcus. And Marcus, he was a young man who came down with a terminal illness. And he became very resentful and bitter and angry at everybody, especially God, his family, even the doctors, anyone who tried to help him. Because he was so resentful at the fact that he would be dying at a young age. But at one point, he had a sudden change that came over him so strong. They heard about an incident of a young woman close to his age who was found in her bed in that morning, stabbed in the heart. So she had died. And as he contemplated this, he thought about, who am I to live another day? She has died, and yet I am still here. And in that realization, he became flooded with a new appreciation of just this one day to live. An appreciation of his family, of God, of life in general. And he had such a strong change come over him that actually people thought he became crazy, because he started just saying so many sweet things to everyone who came through. He stopped complaining about his sufferings. He started embracing every moment of life that he had. When his mother would weep for him, he would say, "Don't weep. I've long yet to live, long to rejoice with you, and life is glad and beautiful." Friends came to see him, and all of a sudden, for the first time in his life, he was actually shocked at the fact that he would have any love at all. He'd say, "Dear ones, what have I done that you should love me so? How can you love anyone like me? And how was it that I did not know? I did not appreciate your love until this very moment." And then servants would come to him, and he would say, "Why do you have to serve me? If it were God's will that I should live, I would serve you. For every man must be a servant of his brother." His mother berated him, saying, "It's your illness that makes you speak like this." But he said, "No, believe me, mother. Everyone is truly responsible to all men, for all men, and for everything. I don't know how to explain it to you, but I feel it so painfully, that life is paradise, and that we are all in paradise. But we will not see it. And if we should, we would have heaven on earth tomorrow. And how was it that we went on living, getting angry and not knowing why? Why do we quarrel, try to outshine each other, and keep grudges against one another?" So he had this deep illumination of the meaning of life in such a way that made everything else secondary. And all that mattered was the love that he had present before him. And it led him even to ask forgiveness of everybody who came to him. One thing he said is kind of his concluding thoughts on his life. He said, "There was such a glory of God all about me. The birds, the trees, the meadows, the sky. Only I lived in shame and dishonored it all, because I did not see the beauty and the glory." So in his blindness, in his bitterness, he failed to see everything around him until what he felt was almost too late. And yet, after that revelation that who was he even to live one more day of his life, all of a sudden he was flooded with this intense gratitude and thanksgiving for every single thing in his life that he had up until that moment. And one evening, his little brother Dimitri came to see him shortly before his death. And And he called him over to his side, and he looked at him in the face for long, and he said, "Well, run and play and enjoy life for me too." And he died just a few days after that. Dmitri was young, but it was a lasting impression, a hidden feeling of it all that remained deep in his heart, ready to rise up and respond when the time came. And so it did 14 years later. So Dmitri grew up and he went into the army, and he fell into a very debaucherous lifestyle, just womanizing and drinking and the violence that came with living in the army. And at one point he was stationed in a town where he fell in love with a young woman. And as sometimes happens, in his deep love for her, he thought that she loved him back. And so he kept getting closer and closer and began building up fantasies that one day he would marry her. And he got sent away for 2 months, and he came back to town only to find out that she'd been betrothed to another man and was now married. And he was so filled with anger and resentment and bitterness and thinking that he had been insulted by her husband, and everyone. He began to humiliate her husband at every chance he got when they were in public. And just fell into a very dark mindset, even to the point where he pushed her husband to challenge him to a duel. And although her husband had nothing to gain from it and was in fact afraid of it, what he was afraid of was that if he refused him to go to the duel, then his wife would lose respect for him. And so he accepted. And that night, Dmitri went home, and that seed that his brother planted in his heart so long ago finally broke into fruition, because he was so filled with anger and resentment and bitterness and had been drinking that night that when he walked in, he began to stumble, and his servant came to help him. And in a rage, he began to punch his servant in the face until he fell on the ground and blood coming down. And he looked at him, and then he stumbled up the stairs and went to bed. And when he woke up, he had this very sick feeling within him. And he walked over to the window, and the whole sky was clear. The sun was coming up. The birds were chirping. It was this beautiful spring day. And he couldn't understand the shame and the guilt that was over him. And he thought to himself, what's the meaning of this? It's something vile and shameful. Is it because I am going to shed blood? No, that's not it. Is it because I'm afraid to die? So that's not it either. So what is it? And right then, the words of his brother before his death came back to him. That who are we to be served? If it were God's will for me to live, I would be a servant, for all men should serve one another. And he realized it was when he punched his servant in the face. Those words came back to him so strong of how far he had fallen. So he immediately got up, he ran downstairs. The carriage was waiting outside for him to take him to the duel with all his friends inside. And he went out to the carriage, but then he saw a servant standing at the door. So he ran back to the door. He asked his forgiveness, and the servant just fell back scared. And then he fell down and prostrated his face on the ground before him and begged his forgiveness. He got up and he ran to the carriage, and he was in great spirits, overabundant with joy. So all his friends were saying, finally, you will definitely show us you will represent well our camaraderie in this duel. And he goes out there. And he stands with the man of the woman that he had loved. And they go back to back, and they take their paces 10 away from one another, and then they immediately turn around to shoot. And he lifts up his gun, and his adversary lifts up his gun, and he lets him shoot. And the bullet grazes his cheek and his ear. And yet he doesn't take a shot. He says, "Thank God no man must die today." And he takes his pistol and he throws it into the forest. And his adversary asked, what is the meaning of this? Or why won't you take your shot? He said to him, "Forgive me, young fool that I am, sir, for my unprovoked insult to you and for my forcing you to fire at me. I am 10 times worse a man than you are, and maybe more. Tell that to the one whom you hold so dear in this world." And although all of his friends were berating him for it and calling him a coward for refusing to take the shot, News of this public confession spread all around the towns, and people started inviting him into their houses and at parties, asking them, what happened to you that you would change your mind so suddenly? And he told them the story of his brother, how for the first time in 14 years, those words came back to him, and he realized how much he was responsible for all the men around him and how much his sin was going to affect another. And that simply out of a wounded pride and his rejection, he was about to kill a man simply for loving the same woman that he did. And then the next story. Because news of that story spread, but one man became very interested in his testimony and began to follow him around to the different houses that he went. And this man had been an official in the town, in a very prominent position. He's respected by all, very rich, and had a great reputation for benevolence. And he was a man about 50 years old, and he'd been married for about 10 years and had 3 children by this time. And the man came to see him one evening and told him, I have listened to your story with great interest. You are, I see, a man of great strength of character, as you have dared to serve the truth, even when doing so, risk incurring the contempt of all. He said, tell me, please, what were your exact sensations, if you can recall them, at the moment when you made up your mind to ask forgiveness at the duel? And he told him of his brother's words and how he came to see that heaven was all around him and that he himself was defiling because of his action. And the man's eyes lit up and said, I believe that. I believe that heaven is within us and we can have it as soon as we conform ourselves to the truth. And he spoke with such passion, but his eyes were glazed over and you could tell there was something so deep in him that he wanted to share. But he couldn't. And he kept coming back to him night after night after night, just talking of God, talking of life, talking of his moment of truth. And yet every time he'd get to the moment where he'd want to tell him something, he'd find an excuse to leave. Until one night he came to him and just paced back and forth, grabbing his head. He said, do you know I murdered someone? Dmitri couldn't believe it. This was one of the greatest men that town had known of. And at first he wouldn't believe him. But he said, you see how much it has cost me to say the first word, the word I've uttered to no man before. But now I have said it. I feel I've taken the first step and I shall go on. He went on to explain to him how 14 years before he had murdered a beautiful young woman, how he had fallen in love with her, and he declared his feelings and tried to persuade her to marry him. But she had already given her heart to another man. So she refused his offer and asked him never to come back. But sometime after, in a jealous rage, so hurt by that resentment and the bitterness that she would belong to another, he snuck into her room at nighttime and stabbed her in the heart, and then jumped out the window before anyone ever knew it was him. And because he was such a quiet man, nobody ever questioned. They didn't even know that he had interest in her at all. So he got away with the crime, and yet he couldn't escape his own conscience. And so he started, after little by little, he tried to forget that it even happened. But every time it'd keep coming back to him and back to him. So he started giving money away, thinking that if he'd help other families and orphans, that would soothe his conscience. And it didn't. Then he thought, well, my burden will be to carry this sorrow and this pain and to pray it off. And yet it only got heavier and heavier and heavier. And then he thought, maybe when I get a wife and children, I can finally forget about this. And yet it only made it worse. Every time his wife looked at him in love, or his children came to him and called him daddy and asked him to read to them, it only made her think about the woman that would never have that because he stole it from her. Until one day he heard of the duel and that public confession of Dmitri. And he said, looking at you, I had made up my mind that I must confess. And Dmitri said, is it possible that such a trivial incident could give rise to such a resolution in you? He said, my resolution has been growing But looking at you, I reproached myself, and I envied you. I knew the kingdom of God was within me, locked away by my sin, and all I needed to do was to confess. And then I too could possess it once again. And after a long, hard battle within himself, overcoming every reason that he had to keep it hidden, he finally made his public confession of his own murder 14 years before. But what was so interesting about it is the fact that when Marcus conformed himself to the truth and accepted it in love and humility and embraced life for what it was, even though it was being cut short in him, he planted a seed in his brother that in itself would come to fruition 14 years later and be in a moment where his own conforming himself to his truth would enlighten a man who had committed a grave murder 14 years earlier. That's the apostolate of being. Because we don't know the fruits of what happens when we ourselves live out the truth in our life. But the more we conform ourselves to Jesus Christ and the truth of our own hearts, to live according to his gospel and what we know in our hearts to be true, by that very act, we plant the seeds in everybody else's hearts around us. Seeds that we may never see come to fruition. But by our very living out of it, will be planted. So let us pray for the grace, especially this Lent, as we go into beginning Ash Wednesday. How is it that I can more fully conform my life to the truth of Christ, especially anything in my heart that has been nagging at me, that is keeping me from possessing that love and that joy of the gospel? And to the degree that we live out that message within our own life, especially conforming it in this Lenten season, by embodying that truth, we will inspire everybody who comes into our path. And that is the apostolate of being.